It's gone global. You're seeing it done in every country. My first encounter into the mindset of a powerlifter occurred when I was 24 years old, so 18 years ago. Back then, I was doing heavy walking barbell lunges. I worked my way up to 225 pounds for 20 steps, so 10 reps with each leg, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It took me 14 minutes to recuperate to be able to do the next set. Back then, all these articles were saying lunges are for sissies. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This walking barbell lunge is the hardest thing ever. And that's when I first realized that powerlifters are not always very logical. Now, powerlifters care about 4 numbers. They care about their squat, their bench, their deadlift, and their total. Anything else is irrelevant. So it's okay to do lifts that build those numbers, but if they don't, it's not worth doing in their minds. And that's where you come up with their terminology, the main lifts and the assistance lifts. Now, what if you're a female and you want nice glutes? That's your #1 goal. Well, then shouldn't the hip thrust be the main lift? And should everything else be assistance lifts? So let's not be fooled by powerlifter terminology or powerlifter mindset. Now, I've seen all these big, strong men make fun of lunges and make fun of hip thrusts, but I'd like to see those guys do a 225-pound for 20-step lunge and do a 405-pound for 20-rep hip thrust with good form. Do them both with good form, and tell me what you feel afterwards. If you still think they're for pussies, then my hat's off to you. You're a bigger man than me. Recently, I saw a video on Facebook with Jim Wendler, someone who I used to highly respect, and he was talking about how the hip thrust should not be a main lift. You can see the clip here.
So I was like, I read somewhere when they're like every article on training is pretty much the same. It says, hey, make sure you get your big potato, your big steak in, right? Your squat, bench, deadlift, press, row. And then I saw hip thrust in there. And I was like, when the fuck did this happen? Like, at what point, what world do I live in now where the hip thrust is the same thing as a deadlift? And I just got such a kick out of that.
Now, this is disappointing for a number of reasons. So remember listening to a podcast where Jim Wendler was talking about how he can no longer tie his shoes. He has to have his wife help him put on his socks and tie his shoes every morning, and that's from all his years of powerlifting. So why aren't we talking more about this? And why do competitive powerlifters try to have you go down the same path as them when they're beat to smithereens? Our goals for our clients should be, let's get them some glutes, let's get them some leg muscle, but let's keep their joints healthy and prevent them from needing surgery so they can keep lifting decade after decade after decade. Now, if your goal is to build glutes and you think of the lifts that can help you reach your goals, it's gonna be hip thrusts, squats, deadlifts, lunges, back extensions, military press, rows, bench, chin-ups. Those don't help. Now, I love those lifts and they're a staple to me, but make no mistake about it, the hip thrust is numero uno. Now, why wouldn't hip thrust be a main lift? For men and women. Let's compare it to a squat and a deadlift. You're moving a huge load through a large range of motion, using a lot of muscles. You can hook up electrodes and measure EMG. You can stand on a force plate and measure things like force, power, rate of force development, and work. Any way you slice it, the hip thrust is an amazing exercise. And most of all, it's very well suited for progressive overload. Now, sure, you have the idiots who screw it up, don't lock out or throw their chest up, but the same can be said for squats and deadlifts. An exercise is judged by how it's done right, not by the people who screw it up. But most important is the safety of the hip thrust. In 12 years of prescribing the hip thrust to clients, I haven't had a single injury, not one in 12 years. The same can be said for my friend Jim Aaron and Ben Bruno. Both of them have coached thousands of people in the last decade and have given hip thrust to almost all their clients, and they've never had an injury as well. Here at Glute Lab, we're going on almost a year of being in business. We're training a couple hundred clients month in and month out, and we haven't had a single injury here. And the reason why is because we do squats and deadlifts, but not heavy barbell versions. We do lever squats, goblet squats, kettlebell deadlifts, lever deadlifts. We do straddle lifts, but those are what we would call assistance lifts. Our main lifts here at Glute Lab are the hip thrust, the straddle lift, the seated hip abduction, and the Nordic ham curl. Those are our 4 main lifts. And this is why we haven't had a single injury and everyone feels great here. Thrusts are easy to learn, they're well suited for every body type. In contrast, some human bodies just aren't well suited to squat or deadlift, especially if you have relatively long femurs. For the squat or relatively short arms for the deadlift, you're placing yourself at greater injury risk. Now, I trained at a powerlifting gym in Tempe, Arizona called Revolution Training Systems for a couple of years. These guys were beasts, but they were always getting injured. It just comes with the territory. I talked to Dave Tate, he said it's just bound to happen. If you're squatting and deadlifting hundreds and hundreds of pounds week in and week out, you're eventually gonna need a hip replacement surgery, a knee replacement surgery. You're gonna injure your back. That's the sport of powerlifting. Earlier this year, I put out a survey, and almost 14,000 people answered that survey, and the general public isn't fooled. Now, powerlifters and coaches and other experts can try to fool people, but the general lifters know the truth. Earlier this year, I polled 13,696 lifters. Now, in this survey, I asked, what is your favorite glute exercise? And I had 16 different answers. The number one exercise was the hip thrust with 54%. Squats got 6%, deadlifts got 12%. I asked, which exercise do you feel your glutes working the hardest? 77% picked the hip thrust, 4% the squat, 7% the deadlift. When I asked which muscle is the limiting factor when you hip thrust, squat, and deadlift, for the hip thrust, 47% felt that the glutes were the limiting factor. For the squat, 6% felt the glutes were the limiting factor. And for the deadlift, 12% felt that their glutes were the limiting factor. When asked which glute exercise felt the most dangerous, the responders chose the squat as the most dangerous at 39%, compared to 33% for the deadlift and 5% for the hip thrust. 62% of responders felt that the deadlift was the most dangerous for the back, followed by 25% for the squat and 3% for the hip thrust. 49% felt that the squat was the most dangerous for the knees, followed by 2% for the deadlift and 1% for the hip thrust. When asked which exercise is best at growing and developing the glutes, 68% chose the hip thrust. Only 5% chose the squat and 5% chose the deadlift. What's the primary reason why people train the glutes? 68% chose for aesthetics and physique purposes. Only 6% do so to transfer the squat and deadlift. 18% to improve function and athletic performance, and 8% to decrease pain and the likelihood of injury. So there you have it, the survey speaks for itself. So let's envision a world where the hip thrust is the #1 lift worldwide. It's the most popular exercise in the world. What would we expect to see? Now, this is just my clients over the last year alone. I'm not talking about the other millions of people who are doing hip thrusts. This is just what I've observed here at Glute Lab in 2018. This is Massa, this is Jade, this is Jax, here's Nikki, here's Alexis, this is Kiana, this is Dominique, here's Bree. And this is obvious. This is why you've seen The Rock do them several times on his Instagram channel. He loves the hip thrust. Freakishly strong lifters like Steffi Cohen and Zydrunas Zavikas, they're doing their hip thrust and they feel like it transfers to their powerlifting. And you've also seen professional sports players, other actors and actresses. It's becoming very popular. It's gone global. You're seeing it done in every country. Now, if you watch this video and this doesn't make complete, total sense to you, then what world do I live in?